The world held its breath. Silence breezed across the stagnant grassy fields. The bodies had been buried, the swords and spears had been smelted and recycled. Armies glared at each other from across the peaceful expanse, though none would admit their hope that no more comrades nor enemies would need to fall. The King of Malachi and the Emperor of Saravia, the two largest nations on the planet, met at a neutral site. Surrounded by their bodyguards, they entered an otherwise unmarked and unremarkable tent to discuss their armistice. There were outstanding issues and ideological differences that would never be resolved, but both leaders had read enough reports of the dead that they, just like every commoner family who had lost someone they loved, could no longer stomach the thought of more blood being spilled. They reached a compromise, and, as both leaders scratched their quills against the parchment, they hoped that their respective subjects would find in their hearts the ability to forgive the other side and come to similar understandings. The wound of the civilized world scabbed over, but emotions still seeped. Distrust festered as grudges were declared, and rumors spread about the inferiority of this theology or that philosophy. But the world continued to turn, and those with shorter memories, particularly those who saw economic opportunities in the growing peace, got on with their business. Though the peace remained cold for a decade, eventually one merchant company from the Saravian Empire sent a trade delegation north across the ocean to Malachi. When it returned with its crew intact, a body of men that discussed in no uncertain terms how beautiful and exotic Malachi was, the company sent even more trade vessels. Business boomed on both sides. Perhaps the foreign country was not the land of lawless brigands and immorality as told by the rumors. However, peace and understanding only go so far, as does a historian's reach. Events continue to happen across both countries, most of which had no impact on the lives around them. But two events occurred and coalesced into a single outcome. The outcome would be studied, but the events themselves would not, and perhaps that could be called a tragedy. Over 50 years passed since the armistice, long enough for most of the belligerents of the war to retire or pass away. The merchant company had thrived and expanded to many cities, including Lowry, the westernmost city in the Saravian Empire. Lowry, true to its name, was a dirty town full of dirty people and dirty politics, a place even the homeless sought to avoid. Those who were too unlucky or too stupid to live their lives anywhere but Lowry often joined merchant ships as soon as they were able, as a life stranded at sea was often preferable to any extended stay in the port town. So it was that a sailor of no consequence boarded a ship from the Lowry headquarters to travel north to Waysteel, the busiest port city in Malachi. Many of the crews had lost men on the same route, not to disease or accidents, but because they had preferred to remain abroad. Though the Saravian government tried to keep such emigrations a secret, there was little that guards and officials could do to silence a harbor's gossip. None of that mattered to the sailor. He was an especially dirty man from an especially dirty family in this especially dirty town. He frequently fought anyone who crossed his path, as he found his enemies unable to hurl insults through shattered jaws and slit tongues. He took on a certain reputation that he had no wish to deny, and though it made him few friends, he was at least left in relative peace. But the sailor was not necessarily cold-hearted or emotionless. He had the same emotions as any other man, including his desire to better his situation and leave the dirty town. As much as he hated sailing and the idea of taking orders from the many physically inferior meat sacks he met, the pay was good. It was very good. And, if he was careful and resisted the temptation to spend his entire wage on ale and women, he could legally claw his way out of Lowry without emigrating in just a few short years. After receiving his assignment from the company, he boarded the dirty ship, which possessed a name he could not be bothered to learn. He would never be able to recall much of anything about the trip, given how ordinary and boring it had been. Perhaps if it had been exciting, perhaps if he had not had the desire to visit a tavern the moment he disembarked, the outcome would not have happened. The other event started a few weeks later in Waysteel itself, an event that was so ordinary as to be common among all classes and creeds of people across the world. A girl of 19 years argued with her parents at increasing volumes about her perceived lack of freedom. The verbal fight ended, as it usually did, with her grasping one of her mother's so-called priceless vases and flinging it across the room so it would satisfyingly shatter against the stone walls of the mansion. She always followed that up with several expletives that she was not supposed to know. With her father protesting that he had no idea where the girl could have learned that kind of language, she retreated to her bedroom and slammed the door behind her. She enjoyed the act of total rebellion, for how could anyone rebel against their parents in a more direct way? She, after all, understood herself to be the only one who had truly mastered the art of fighting back against them, and she knew her superior intellect prevented her from making any mistakes. Her rebellious nature was as much a part of her as her captivating looks that caused her peers unlimited jealousy. She dramatically threw herself on the bed, knowing that no one could see her pose, but she needed to practice. She knew that she needed to train herself on ways to manipulate the man that she would eventually be stuck with marrying. She would have to submit to his desires, of course, but only at a proper pace. Do not allow him too much that she would become the pawn. Do not allow him so little that he would seek better fulfillment elsewhere. These were her lessons, for she was rich. Or more precisely, her parents were rich, but it amounted to the same thing. She sat up on her expensive bed, looked at herself in her expensive mirror, admired her gorgeous hair and expensive dress, and examined the expensive jewelry on her slender fingers. Her rich suitors often complimented these very specific parts of her, and she always thanked them before dismissing them with a wave of her wealthy hand. Her father had inherited his riches from his father, who had inherited it from his father, and so on along the generations beyond her counting. Her expensive schooling provided her with these facts, along with the knowledge that her wealth indeed made her a better person than the suitors who showered her with gifts from afar. She didn't know most of the names on the tags attached to the gifts, because one did not become rich by overly acknowledging others. After all, familiarity might change the definition of an object from a gift to a favor, something that necessitated a return that she had no interest in paying. Despite the wealthy suitors, her expensive gifts and possessions, and this glorious mansion that she was forced to reside in against her will, she still yearned for freedom. Not freedom from riches, certainly. Giving that up would be an unnecessary handicap on life that made absolutely no logical sense and with no tangible benefit. But rather, these riches would work in any city in Malachi, and she would be respected wherever she went. Her name carried weight, her appearance carried attention, and her riches carried power. It was all anyone needed to be respected. For that matter, it was the very definition of respect. But she could not prove that others respected her when she was trapped in the mansion. Weeks before, she had taken her father's expensive letter opener from atop his desk and stashed it within her own expensive vanity, just to await a night like this one. She withdrew it, cut away her expensive dress so it exposed her delicate legs, and she sliced apart her expensive bed covers into thin ribbons. Her schooling in the mundane subjects had not, it seemed, been useless after all. She could tie rudimentary knots, at least enough to support her weight. She tied one end of her makeshift rope around her bedpost, snaking the other end out the second-story window. She had heard the tales that this type of escape was possible, and she decided that if a fictional peasant girl could do it, so could she. And it was without too long of a delay, or too much injury, that she did eventually descend from her second-story window to land in the primly trimmed bushes below. She escaped her father's lands by simply walking around them. The few guards on duty were too richly paid to be corruptible, but they never considered the idea that anyone would want to leave the mansion, especially not from the back. She stayed in the shadows until she could circle the grounds. Then she walked toward the city. The road was lonely, as it should be. She and her parents needed little human contact, and they rarely needed to go to anyone. They often summoned people they needed to see and expected prompt response, for that is the way the rich are to be treated. Naturally, her parents had to travel to Malachi Castle when summoned by the king or queen. She and her parents knew their place in the social hierarchy, and the royal couple still commanded all. She consciously decided that being the third most important person in the world was acceptable. She eventually entered Waysteel proper. She was unimpressed at the buildings she was forced to walk by. Many were smaller than entire wings of her mansion. Some of the uncouth peasantry still had to use outhouses for their unspeakable business. She did not understand how they could stomach the shame of the walk back into the house after such a situation. She had nowhere specific to go and knew none of the commoners in Waysteel, but she always enjoyed watching the ships pass through the harbor. She knew Waysteel was important, and that almost anything could be bought there, since the ships traveled to all corners of the world, though she confessed she didn't have the need or desire to learn just exactly what that meant. Still, there were many ships in the harbor of all different shapes and sizes with different cargoes and sailors, which made for an interesting, if not blood-rushing view. She grew bored of watching the ships after an hour and found herself thirsting. With her looks, her riches, and her newly exposed legs, she knew she could manipulate a man into paying for some wine. Surely the tavern that all these sailors were flocking to sold some Mayberry Fields wine, for all businesses worthy of their self-respect would carry it. She walked into the tavern without any hint of self-awareness. She was rich, therefore she was allowed anywhere she wanted to go. The tavern smelled awful, mixtures of body fluids and stale alcohol, and she almost regretted her choice of venues for the evening. But she could feel the sailors eyeing her, and she decided to stay. They were men, just like the suitor she dismissed with a wave of her wealthy hand, and surely they would understand their place next to a rich girl such as her. She approached the bar and, as expected, soon became the center of attention as men vied for the right to purchase drinks for her. 2 men loudly became committed to giving her anything she wanted, and they walked outside to settle their dispute. But as they did so, a 3rd sailor actually bought her a drink. She considered learning his name, as he was certainly clever, but she decided it would be infinitely better of her station to snub him. So she politely thanked him for the drink, ale, which was not her favorite, but at least it was free, and walked over to the opposite corner of the tavern without another word. She sipped at her drink, allowing a couple drops to fall on the exposed skin just above her neckline so the cool liquid ran into her cleavage. She giggled and exclaimed how very cold it was, a well-practiced technique that she had mastered years before. It drew more attention and, more importantly, more offers for free drinks. She lost count of how many she accepted, but she never consumed a full beverage, always accidentally, spilling most of it on the table or insisting the sailors finish them off for her to prove how much they could drink. She maintained her sobriety long after many others were too tired or too sick to continue coherently talking to her. Better still, some of the sailors started offering more than drinks for future favors, some of which she didn't exactly understand the definitions. It mattered not. She took everything, made her false promises, and dismissed them with a wave of her wealthy hand to prove she would consider fulfilling her end of the bargains only when she was ready. Hours later, she finally decided to leave, having had her fun for the night. She bid goodbyes to some of the men who had given her more than drinks, then started to leave the tavern. But that one sailor, the one she had snubbed who bought her first drink of the evening, took it upon himself to forget his place and approach her. She had dealt with overly aggressive suitors before, and politely listened to his slurring, as rich women are supposed to do. When he was done declaring his love, throwing around words like soulmate and marriage, she realized that he was apparently too drunk to remember his place. She smiled a rich smile, then gently reminded him that she was rich, and he was not. The sailor strangely did not understand the logic behind her concise argument. She tried again, this time physically dismissing him with a wave of her wealthy hand, but the sailor broke every rule of etiquette by having the audacity to smack her hand away. So she tried dismissing him again, certain that a crisper tone and more aggressive wave of her wealthy hand would remind him just to whom he was speaking. It did not have the effect she desired. Instead, he took a firm hold of her wrist and slurred some demands about what she owed him. He clearly did not understand that the rich do not owe anyone anything. She closed her eyes as she specifically lectured him on his breaches of protocol and etiquette, his lacking of hygiene and questionable appearance, his obvious lack of intelligence and stature, and his scent that would be better placed in the outhouses she had had the unfortunate circumstance of passing by when she entered the town. She concluded by loudly complaining that it was the barkeeper's responsibility to ensure such men are controlled. Her words sparked laughter from almost everyone else in the tavern, which admittedly confused her. She had not been joking, and could not understand why a serious lesson such as this should fall on deaf ears. Even the barkeeper seemed uninterested in fulfilling his responsibility to protect her. But more of an immediate concern to her was that the sailor, this peasant, was refusing to take his hand off her wrist. He looked around at his fellows all laughing at his expense, and his eyes grew wide as his grip tightened. His grubby fingers dug into her delicate flesh and possibly, so she guessed, broke her bones into hundreds of pieces. She tried a different tactic, a submissive voice, but the sailor paid her no mind. Finally, after he threatened and his slurring about taking what he was promised, he started to drag her toward the stairs that led to the second floor of the tavern. She realized she might not be able to escape on her own, and a general panic gripped her heart. She was sure she could explain to the sailor, eventually, who she was and how rich she was if he'd simply listened to reason. Either way, she would certainly find a way for that barkeeper to be removed from this tavern or executed outright, since this entire breach of conduct was ultimately his fault. She wiggled and struggled, trying to free her wrist. She slipped on the floors that were slick from spilled drinks that she was sure she had nothing to do with, and it caused her even more pain as the sailor dragged her towards some unknown destination. She considered calling out for help, but it would be undignified, so she settled on berating the brute who was taking liberties that he absolutely did not deserve. But then she was approached by an exceptionally dirty sailor, whose clothes indicated that he had just come from an exceptionally dirty ship, and with her frightened eyes shining brightly on him, the dirty sailor balled his brawny fist and smashed her captor in the jaw. The dirty sailor continued to fight despite her captor immediately releasing her and crumbling to the ground. Eventually, after several dozen blows, the dirty sailor picked up a spent ale glass and smashed it against the floor. He picked up one of the shards of glass and stabbed it a single time into the throat of her former captor. She was horrified at the gore, but not at the result. In truth, this is exactly what she knew the peasant deserved for overstepping the social limitations that had been placed upon him by God and the king. After marveling at the blood that continued to pour out of the dead man's wound, she looked up at the dirty sailor expectantly. He finally and unemotionally stood and discarded the glass shard onto the corpse. He took one look at the girl, lightly scoffed, then started to leave the tavern. She blinked, then quickly approached him. She asked whether he would buy her a drink, and he answered that he didn't understand why she would want another one. He encouraged her to go home, but cared not whether she actually did. She wanted attention. He wanted peace, even from her. It was unusual enough that she followed him out of the tavern. He knew, or seemed to know, that she followed him, but he showed no concern. He eventually found an inn, easily the dirtiest one she had ever seen, one where the innkeeper simply directed him to a room for the night and ignored the drops of blood on his clothing. She followed him up to his room, watched him lie on the bed, and was surprised that he actually closed his eyes, as if he wanted to sleep. She closed the door behind her and sat on the uncomfortable wicker chair next to the wall. She again asked why he wanted nothing, or whether he was merely playing hard to get, as some of her suitors did. She mentioned her name and her riches. He assured her that he didn't care about her or her riches, and merely wanted to be left alone. She continued to sit as she discussed the situation with him at length. It was simply an impossible concept. He needed to care about her. If he didn't, how could he know her power? How could he know her riches? How could he know how much respect he was supposed to have for her? She continued to lecture him on all her qualifications, her life, and a detailed description of her genealogy to prove how much she mattered to the world. The conversation quickly took a turn for the worse as the dirty sailor fell asleep in the middle of her sentence. She wanted to prod him awake, but she started to feel her own fatigue as well. She considered returning home, but with another unfortunate moment that could only be considered a tragedy in hindsight, she made the decision to remain in his room and sleep in the chair despite the discomfort. She awoke when a noise startled her. It took her a moment to realize the source. It was morning and the sailor was leaving. He had opened the door and banged it against the wall, and was already starting to walk out. She quickly stood, stumbled over her own feet, and pursued him. She caught up as he reached the foot of the stairs of the inn or whatever it was. She fell in step, then continued asking him questions about his behavior, not noticing the wide berth all the other people gave them. She had to stop her interrogation several times. The pain in her neck was distracting, but she remained focused on understanding the dirty sailor and his actions. He gruffly ignored or brushed aside all of her questions, and rather pointedly went about his day. She noticed he never once held open a door for her, and he was more or less tolerating her presence, rather than interacting with her. She had done that to enough rich suitors that she recognized the signs, but she was surprised anyone would do that to her. Still, though a part of her was deeply offended, she was mostly too shocked to voice her discontent. She followed him as he received payment for something, probably his trip that brought him here in the first place, and as he visited the Waysteel Public Park. From there, she could barely see her mansion on the hill beyond the outskirts of town. She decided against going back. It was at the park, as he stared at things only he evidently saw, that he asked her why she had been at the tavern the previous night. Finally, with the opportunity to talk about herself, she detailed exactly how unfair her parents had been to her, and that she wanted freedom more than anything. He simply shrugged, and he suggested that she was free now. She did not understand, but she continued to shadow him even as he left the park. The rest of the day was boring, but she felt that going home would be too needlessly complicated. She didn't need the arguments about where she had been, or what she had been doing, or why she had cut away most of her skirt. She drew satisfaction from the daydream of her parents frantically searching for her and ordering the city guards to locate her. She finally showed them how much they needed her. Before long, the dirty sailor boarded his ship. She started to follow him, but she was halted by several other sailors as she stood at the foot of the gangplank. Even she knew the old sailor's superstition that it was bad luck for women to be on a ship, but she was different. And not just because of the riches, but now she had a friend who was a sailor. Surely that must count for something. The dirty sailor himself was unconcerned. He busied himself on the deck of the ship doing ship things. She didn't know the terms or the jobs, but he appeared to be practiced as he moved ropes and crates in different directions. She watched him with a little awe as the other sailors stepped around her, muttering about her and giving her looks of ill intent. Finally, the captain, he had to be the captain, arrived and explicitly asked everyone whose wench she was. She took one last look up toward her mansion that she could no longer see, then made a decision. She took a deep breath, set her jaw, and marched up the gangplank. She stood beside the exceptionally dirty sailor, then returned the captain's angry gaze with a challenging one of her own that drew upon the heritage of generations of her wretched ancestors. She had the right to be here. The captain started to protest, but the dirty sailor simply looked up into his eyes. There were no words, merely an expression that she did not recognize. It was a challenging one, but there was something else in his eyes, something almost dead and cold. Whatever it was, the captain relented, then threatened the sailor and declared he wouldn't get his pay for the return trip. The sailor didn't react. He merely went back about his work. The journey to Lowry was unimpressive and boring. She managed to control her seasickness well, and, more interestingly, the dirty sailor controlled the gazes and words of evil intent from the rest of the crew. She could not understand how or why he would defend her, especially because he wasn't making a profit for his actions. This strange behavior continued as they entered a tavern in Lowry, or more accurately, as she followed him into it. She was immediately set upon by the dozens of sailors there, all of them offering to buy her drinks, but this time she felt no desire to play her game. She instead sat near the dirty sailor, rarely speaking, but ever intrigued by his every action and spoken word. As time passed, one sailor, who had had too much to drink, started to take the same liberties as did the peasant in Waysteel. He made several vague threats and demands in her general direction, and even moved to grope her. Once again, the dirty sailor moved quickly to stop the man who was clearly beneath her notice. The dirty sailor was ruthless as he beat the other sailor with his fists on a bar stool. As the stranger lay on the ground, blood gushing out of every orifice on his head and surrounded by his own teeth, the dirty sailor stomped his face hard enough to explode his nose. The dirty sailor then started to leave the tavern, but paused at the door. She looked down at the stranger's mangled face and couldn't help but smile. With a toss of her head so her gorgeous hair would dramatically flow around her, she joined the dirty sailor at the door and accompanied him to the closest inn. She didn't know why she was reminiscing about how they had met, but she was happy now. Maybe it was because they were back in Waysteel, where it had all started 20 years before. Their relationship had developed quickly, with him being a source of intrigue and power, and her being convenient. It was hardly a fairy tale romance, but they were both extremely happy. Her name still carried weight after all, and banks were all too happy to provide her money from her trust. It did not matter, and was in fact expected, that plebeian strangers just wouldn't understand. Their relationship had never experienced a rough patch. Indeed, it had simply grown stronger with each passing moment. She accompanied him on every voyage, both personal and professional. She always chose the tavern, and he always arrived an hour later after she had chosen her target. Then she would use all the clever tricks she had learned from her rich education to get the target's attention. She would make promises, giggle a certain way, display the right amount of cleavage or leg, and always let them get a whiff of her hair. It was never difficult to make the target fall for her. At this point, it wasn't even a challenge. And then her sailor would arrive to attack the peasant, which would teach him his place below her. It served them both well, reminding the target that a rich woman backed by a powerful man was the greatest force in the world, to be more respected than anyone else. Even after 2 decades, the fight would always excite her, and she'd always look on with a bright smile she could not control. And after that, they would retreat to an inn and follow the natural course of events that occurred when 2 people who were perfectly equal in different ways found each other alone at night. It was the most fulfilling relationship, not just for her, but in the history of the world. Only they knew what true love could be. She was especially excited tonight. 20 years. Her hair still did not possess a single gray lock that she could find, and her body was still a sight to behold. And here they were again, not just in the same city, but the same tavern. It had changed, of course. It called itself a restaurant now, as the city had become gentrified in the interim, but she knew the truth. Ultimately, it didn't matter. She hadn't changed, and neither had her sailor. She had already chosen her target for the evening, a man in his late 30s, blonde, seemingly fresh out of a relationship. Whatever the reason, he was hurting enough to drown his sorrow with perpetual drinking. It would have been pathetic had she not seen it a million times. Truly, few knew the love that she felt, and those who lost it felt the need to replace the holes in their hearts with alcohol. She smoothed out the wrinkles of her skirt and took one last look around. Suddenly she noticed one more man near the corner of the common room. He was very handsome, with intriguing dark eyes, long black hair, and an undignified scruffy beard. He also looked uncomfortable, like he didn't belong there. Was he upset about the tavern, the city, the country? He didn't look like he was from Malachi, and with the peace that infected most of the world, it was entirely possible he was just a poor immigrant. She didn't often change her targets, but this one seemed to be a worthy challenge. Her new target looked tired, probably already drunk. It was unusual to see a man sitting at a table like that by himself. He must have been stood up for some social engagement. That would explain the fatigue and the 2 full wine glasses sitting on the table. He was perfect. He had a bit of a gut and wore ill-fitting white clothes without any personal swords or knives belted at his waist. He would not be able to defend himself, especially if he was drunk or tired. How had she not noticed them before? She saw her sailor appear at the doorway. He took a seat somewhat away from her, but still within view of the entire room so he could see where she was headed. It was time. She stood from her table and walked across the room. She swayed her hips subtly, enough to attract attention from everyone without turning heads or drawing insults from the petty women who polluted the atmosphere. She gave a quick glance to her sailor and gave him a tiny wink, then moved on to her target's table. Her target sat still, staring off into space. She quickly filled his vision with her neckline as she leaned over the table and asked if he was in good health. He looked through her, apparently not realizing she was there. This had happened before, usually when the target was too drunk to understand what was going on. They normally didn't last long. She subtly adjusted her neckline to give him a more generous view, then looked him directly in the face, and again inquired about his health. This got the man's attention, but strangely, despite a cursory glance at her skin, he looked directly in her eyes and told her gently that he wanted to be left alone. It was a strange moment for her, certainly something that almost never happened. How dare he dismiss her? Did he not know who she was? Or at least, did he not realize what she looked like? Was he blind? She took a closer look at him, and something strange tingled in the back of her mind. She felt like she should know this man. There was some recognition there. Was he an old suitor? They were back in Waysteel after all, but no, if he was an old suitor, he definitely would have recognized her and would have been more friendly. She couldn't have changed that much in 20 years, could she? No. He was simply being difficult, and she had dealt with that kind of man before. She sidled slowly around to his side of the table, then sat beside him. He didn't look like the sort to have a lot of money, but she decided to take a sip from his second wine glass anyway. She almost gasped as the drink touched her tongue. It was Mayberry Fields wine. She complimented his choice. It was one of the few times she didn't have to lie to a target. He gave her a gruff look. Then he politely asked her to leave him alone again. He was no longer looking at her skin. In fact, he spent most of the time looking away from her. This was unacceptable. Maybe he was married? She gently touched his cheek while feigning concern for his tired appearance. He recoiled from her touch and instinctively held up his left hand to guard his face. No ring. She muttered her insincere apology, then stood. However, she didn't go very far. She merely stood beside her target, retelling her usual story that she was just so lonely, and if he was lonely too, it would be best for them to be lonely together. Her target once again affirmed that he had no interest. He handed her the wine glass from which she had taken her sip. Then he signaled for the waitress. This had never happened before, and she refused to lose. Not now, not in this city. She decided to touch him in a slightly more intimate manner, as terrifying and disgusting as the idea was. She set the wine glass back on the table, then stood behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders while whispering how attractive he was. Slowly, she started to move her hands toward his neck and collarbone. She had felt him become tense the moment she touched him, but she had not expected him to react so suddenly. He shot up to his feet as if his chair had suddenly burst into flames, and he turned so quickly to face her that he bumped the table and spilled some of that rich wine. He raised his voice and told her in no uncertain terms that he had no desire to associate with anyone that night, especially not a strange woman who was clearly forgetting her etiquette. Well, those were not his exact words. His exact words had been much rougher, and even contained profanity. Worse still, he accused her that she had done something outside of her station. She was rich. There was nothing outside of her station. She proceeded to tell him, at length, exactly what she thought of his etiquette, which was always the signal. Her sailor still moved as he had in his 20s, and he quickly crossed the room to the target. Her sailor threw the first punch aimed at the back of the target's neck. But the target reacted faster than what should be humanly possible. He turned, caught the sailor's arm, and used the sailor's own momentum against him. The target threw the sailor into the table and collapsed it with a deafening crash. The chairs cracked and split, and the wine glasses shattered and splattered the Mayberry Fields wine on the floor. She momentarily considered buying them a bottle once her sailor recovered from his temporary fall. It wouldn't be the first time he walked away from one of these moments with a few bruises, and she felt herself already getting excited at the prospect of easing his pain that night in their inn-room. The sailor grabbed his back instinctively and flashed her a small smile. As he stood, he drew his hand from his back and displayed a shard of the broken wine glass. He gripped it tightly, enough so that he caused himself to bleed, and stabbed it toward the peasant's throat. As fast as the sailor was, the peasant was miraculously faster. So fast, in fact, that she thought he moved as a blur, suddenly shifting a couple inches to the side to have a better angle. He again caught the sailor's arm and flipped him over his side, causing the sailor to crash into the floor. By now, everyone in the tavern had stood and backed away from them. A few had run out to call the city guards. She was a little worried. Her sailor had never been taken down twice before. The target shifted position near the broken table. The sailor stood again. He was woozy and had a flowing gash on his hand from where he had gripped the shard. He stole someone else's ale mug and took a long drink, then looked again at the target and flexed his fingers. He licked some blood off his hand to stain his teeth red, and he flashed a threatening smile at the target. The target looked on with pity. Pity? No one pities them! She started to lecture the target once again on his place in society, but his sharp gaze into her eyes caused her to stay silent. Just his gaze had such power. Who was this man? Finally, the target looked one last time at the sailor, who was rolling his shoulders gently. It was clear he was going to give it one more try. The target sighed softly, shook his head, and spoke a single crisp command. Don't. The sailor attacked, charging forward and drawing his fist back. The target once again moved so quickly as to appear a blur, then caught his arm and threw him once again. This time, however, the sailor missed the table. Instead, his body flew into the split chairs. The very chair the target had been sitting on had lost its back, and its two sharp posts were exposed, as the sailor's back struck it. She had seen the wound before on other men, laughing at their broken bodies as she saw the life leave their eyes. This time she felt nothing but cold shock as the chair post pierced her sailor's back and cut into his spine. Even the sailor was shocked. He tried to stand again, but his legs simply would not respond. She fell to her knees beside him. There were no tears, for tears were undignified, but she held the sailor's hand, telling him he would be fine, that they would recover, that their target would pay for this crime with his life. And the sailor seemed mollified by her words, even as his face froze, and the light in his eyes gave way to the reflection of the abyss into which his soul had fallen. She wasn't sure when she returned home. The target had stayed in the tavern as the city guards arrived. At some point, a woman had emerged from the kitchen and joined the target near the door. She knew she recognized the woman as well, but could not place the name, and she slipped away before she could think about it in much detail. She had retreated back to her mansion on the hill at the edge of Waysteel. Her younger brother now owned it, and he wasn't happy with seeing his sister for the first time in 2 decades. She responded by arguing in increasing volumes about his lack of empathy, then stormed off to her old room, which was surprisingly still available as a guest room. It was there that she threw herself on the bed and wept, releasing emotions that had been building for longer than she could fathom. Her brother joined her in the room after a few moments, attempting to coldly comfort her, but he was unable to provide any real help since he didn't know exactly what the problem was. She would have refused to tell him anyway. How could he know? How could he understand? Their chief servant, a man she didn't recognize, arrived to announce that they were needed in the foyer. Her brother patted her on the shoulder with no emotion, then started to leave. On an impulse, she made herself relatively presentable and followed him. Her mind was a haze. Her memories were the only reason she was able to navigate the mansion at all. She stayed mostly out of sight as her brother opened the door, for it would be undignified of her to show herself at anything less than perfection to a visitor. It was a city guard. He duly saluted. It was good that someone still remembered their place in polite society, and he reported that a fight had occurred in the city that resulted in the accidental death of an irrelevant sailor. It wasn't that anyone here was a suspect. They were above that, obviously. But she overheard the guard tell her brother that he needed to be ready to receive an important guest. It seemed the other party in the conflict was Sir Nicholas Jadenson Grant, an accomplished warrior, the sword arm and closest friend of King Candor Malachi. It seemed Sir Nicholas's lover had witnessed the event as well, and her word was beyond reproach. They were to be housed under close protection in the mansion until King Malachi could arrive to help mediate the situation the next day. Her chest tightened as if the guard's news itself reached through her flesh and grasped her heart. She slowly collapsed to her knees, unable to speak or think clearly. She heard nothing more from her brother or the guard or, in truth, anything in the mansion. She wondered how she could have fallen so far from grace, how she could have let that exceptionally dirty sailor from an exceptionally dirty town in an exceptionally dirty country ever lead her astray. But what she did not know was that the new emperor of the Sarabian Empire had no love for sailors or the lower classes any more than she did. And given how important Waysteel was to the financial and political profit of the Southern Empire, the emperor would feel that retaliatory action was needed. He would make speeches and policies, he would give orders and increase punishments, and he would renew the idea of a completely class-based society to prevent sailors from mixing company with knights and nobles ever again. Sir Nicholas would be forgiving, and would even seek repentance for his accidental killing of the sailor, whose name he never learned, and King Malachi would follow his lead. But the emperor would not be so forgiving. His policies and King Malachi's would come at odds. Their different ideologies of class and social standing would be brought into the light and be upheld as banners for their own ideas of humanity in whole, rather than their countries in part. The scabs that had covered the wounds of war were to be ripped open from the flesh of politics, and another war would start within a year between the two countries. With more advanced weapons and the goading of the last few surviving people who had seen the first one, the war would see hundreds of thousands of more deaths, all for two leaders who could not retain control of the anger and hatred shown by all classes from both countries. But for her, she retained many of her riches. As she sat at her expensive vanity that was now faded with age, she considered her expensive rings that were now dull, admired her hair that was now graying, and reminisced of those wealthy suitors who were now all married. However, she was content again, and felt no more need for any adventures or ideas of unnecessary freedom. After all, what benefit could she give the world? Or, a better question, what could the world possibly offer her? Her riches would never be understood by anyone but her, and she consciously decided that that was a tragedy.